All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome to the Accounts Payable session. My name is Annette Brewer and I'm a program manager on the Dynamics 365 for Operations team. Really happy to be with you here today and I'm impressed. You are some warriors. You made it to the last session. You know, personally it seems like a long time ago since we had the opening keynote. This first day gets to be a long one. Today, we're going to cover the accounts payable process really end to end. We'll go through the various options that we have for vendor invoicing and as well as the payments. We'll also take a look at settlements and revaluation. And throughout, as I'm walking through the various options, I'll bring up these setup parameters that are influencing this scenario as well. In terms of the objectives today, again, I'd just like you to really understand the process and maybe more importantly, like I mentioned, I'd like you to understand kind of those levers and knobs, the parameters that are influencing the particular scenario that we're walking through. And as well, I really want to share with you some of the answers to the most frequent questions that we receive in accounts payable area. Before I get started, though, I always like to kind of get a poll of who's in the audience. So if you are a partner, would you mind, can I have you raise your hand? Okay, do we have any end user customers? All right, and don't be shy on this one. Is there anyone who has never seen accounts payable in Dynamics? Okay, we have one. Good, good, that's very good. This is billed kind of as an introductory session, so it'll kind of be a training mode, but I'll make sure that I'm pointing out the new features from the fall release, and I have some spring release features as well, so there should be some, even if you're a veteran, there should be something for you here. Okay, I'm going to spend virtually the whole time demoing. And we're going to start out in the invoicing area. And really there's one question that you have to answer to determine which method of invoicing you'll be using. And that is, do I have a purchase order or not? That drives which form you're going to be using. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start with just a real basic scenario. I'm going to get some data set up for myself. And I'm going to enter in a purchase order and a receipt. We're not going to dwell on those processes just because they aren't directly in the accounts payable area, but we'll go ahead and get started. And I'm going to enter in a purchase order. And I'll enter it in for one of the vendors. And I'll just order a monitor on here. Here are some keyboards, I guess. I'll take the first one in here. We'll order 12 of them, just so I have some data to actually invoice. I'll go ahead and confirm this. And I don't have encumbrance and counting turned on right now in this system, so I don't have any general ledger updates here. I'll go ahead and I'll post a product receipt real quickly. All right, and now we should be at the point where we can start our invoicing journey. We'll go ahead and I'll start out on the vendor invoice entry workspace. I know that you've seen these workspaces if you've been to any of the sessions. This is designed for our accounts payable invoicing clerk. The manager can also use it obviously as well. The summary tiles on the left-hand side are all about the invoices that are in process, saved out there. The very right-hand side of the screen, you can see this particular workspace has quite a few links on the side. What's always most interesting to me, though, are these tabular lists. That's really the work that you have ahead of yourself. So let me just focus in on the pending vendor invoices. For those of you that are familiar with Dynamics 365, you'll notice we have a new feature that went into fall. Right above the grid, we have a company selector. So you can view the unposted invoices across the companies that you have access to. So let me just go ahead. I think I have some invoices saved out here in USRT. I'll go ahead and select that. And now a couple of invoices have been added here as well. Let me go ahead. I'll just open up the vendor invoice form. And we've also brought that functionality right into the form here itself. So let me just go ahead. I'll select another company. Let me select DEMF. And as the clerk, notice it actually brought me into DEMF. So you can have your clerks, if they're sitting with their stack of invoices next to them, you no longer have to sort out and be logging in and out of companies, so it saves you some time. You can just select your company from right here within the form itself. Let me just go ahead and I'll select USMF again. And log back in there. And let's go back to our workspace actually. A few more things that I wanted to point out. Again, I like these tabular lists. We have some find functionality in here that's pretty popular with customers. If I have a vendor call up with a question, I can just start typing here, and let's say I want to see, I should have a lot of entries for Contoso, and I do have quite a few out here. We have the open purchase orders list and the product receipts list. These are handy tools depending on the situation you're in with your vendor. If your vendors typically bill you for each purchase order, you'd want to look at the open purchase order list. You could come here and you're going to see all of the purchase orders that are in a state that can be invoiced. If, on the other hand, you have vendors that typically bill you each time they ship, you could use the product receipt list. That's where that one would come in handy, because that's going to show you all the product receipts that are in a state where you can invoice. So either one of those methods you could use. And let's go ahead. We'll use our open purchase orders, and let me just find my PO that I just created. Looks like it was probably this one. Right from within the workspace, I can select Invoice Now, and this will bring up my invoice entry form. And I want to show you, I have a little invoice out here over on the side. Let's say this is the invoice that I actually received from the vendor. Looks different from the purchase order, and we're going to deal with those differences. First thing I wanted to note was there is a price change. I think it was $39.99 on the purchase order, and the price has changed here. And I have another line that I need to deal with. So let's go ahead and deal with that price change first. We'll go ahead and close this. I just want to point out, look at the match status. It's passed right now. I'll change this. And immediately it went to fail. That's because I have the invoice matching turned on right now or enabled. You can see the details of the matching right from within the form. At the top of the form, you can see I have some unit price matching errors. The type of matching I'm using here is two-way matching. And then over to the side, I can see I have a 1% tolerance allowed. I'm actually at 2.63%. So let's go ahead. I'm going to save this, actually, and we'll go look at those parameters on how you set this up real quick. I'll just save this. And let's go into Accounts Payable in the Parameters area. There's a special tab just for invoice matching validation. And I want to point out a few of these parameters for you. First thing to note is that with the invoice matching validation, I should probably step back and just explain what that means. That is your typical three-way matching or two-way matching. So we're comparing the unit price of the invoice to the unit price of the purchase order. If it's set for three-way, we're also checking the quantities between the product receipt and the invoice. You can enable that per company or per legal entity. So if you have some that don't require matching, maybe you have manufacturing companies, you always want to be matching in there, you'd enable it in that company. If you have a service one and you don't want to do that, you can leave that not enabled. The second prompt, I'm not going to go through all of these, but the second one I will talk about, you can either allow posting with matching discrepancies, or you can stop it and require approval. Right now I'm just set to allow with warning, and you saw how that match status changed from passed to failed. That's the kind of warning that you get with this option. Now, if I was set up to require approval, I would not be able to post that. Right now I'm set very loosely. I can post that. What we see very commonly is people set up their workflow based on that match status. Out of the box, you can do that in the workflow so that you can actually have a workflow that says, if the match status is failed, route it to, manager Kevin, and if it passes, just automatically go ahead and post that. That's real common that we see that type of setup. The other parameter, it's automatically update header status. I have that set to yes. I would say 99.9% of the time you want that set to yes. And what does this mean? It means that you saw as I changed my unit price, it automatically performed the matching and switched the status for me, or the state. And that's because I have it set to yes. With it set to yes, we're always automatically matching. Anytime there's a quantity change, a cost change, any amount changing on that invoice, matching is actually running behind the scenes. You would have this set to no only if you had a performance issue with a lot of lines. And I'm talking a lot of lines. In our testing and in the one case where I saw a customer take advantage of it, they were flipping POs that had over 10,000 lines on them. So imagine as that's filling in, we're running matching 10,000 times. So that's where this would come in. They have it set to no, and when it's set to no, you actually have to press a button then to match. So once you're done making all your changes in that scenario, you say run matching, and then you can post. But leave that set to yes, unless you have a lot of lines. The other thing I'll just mention, we support two-way matching, which is just between the PO and the invoice in terms of the cost. Again, three-way matching you can set up, and that's including then the product receipt. Okay, that's really all I wanted to touch on matching. So we'll go ahead and we'll close this. And let's go back and find that invoice that I was working with. Okay. And there it is. I'll just go ahead and mark that, and we'll edit. And we get a lot of questions on the accounting for the invoice. So let me just touch on that for a minute. I'm going to bring you into our distribution form. Distributions aren't something new. If you're familiar with AX 2012, we had distributions there as well. If you're not familiar with it, the distribution is one side of the accounting entry. In our case, it's the debit side because we're on the accounts payable side. And it's made up of the main account, which is coming from the posting profile of the item, and it has the dimensions appended onto it. So let's again just go back and look at a few of those things, because we do get a lot of questions as where do these accounts come from. So let me just bring you into the inventory area. And I'm going into the inventory posting profile. It's the purchase order tab where that debit is coming from. So that main account that we saw, that 618,900 I think it was, is coming from one of these types, depending on what type of product that you're dealing with. So if it's a fixed asset, obviously we have some fixed asset things here. I'm dealing with just a normal non-stocked item, and I think it's part of this consumer group. So that's where my account is coming from in this case. So that's the one side. That's the debit. The credit is coming from the vendor posting profile areas. So again, let's go into that. And the credit is simply coming from that summary account. From here, and I believe the vendor that I'm dealing with right now is set up in this vendor group of 40. So it should be the 200, 110. So that's the main account. Again, let's bring up my invoice. And we'll talk about those dimensions. The dimensions, again, are just slices that are added onto the main account. And they're coming from a couple of different areas. In my case, because I actually flipped a purchase order, they're coming from the purchase order, but this same concept applies whether you're on the purchase order or the invoice. We have the dimensions on the header. In this case, I have business unit number 1. Looks like it's coming from the header. I don't have anything else set up at the header. We add to this defaults into the lines. So let's go down here. And you can see I've got a new dimension defaulting in here. That's coming from the item itself. So it adds together the header and then fills in anything else from the item. And that makes up that fully qualified ledger account that we saw. Now that's one side. I just want to show you at the header, we can also see the distributions, both sides of it. Remember I said the accounting distributions were just the one side, the debit side. Here you can see that AP account has come into play. So you see the full accounting before posting the invoice itself. All right, and remember I had another line that was added on that sample invoice, and this is kind of stretching the scenario. We'll say that when I confirmed the purchase order with the vendor, they were running some sort of a sale on a mouse, and I agreed to buy it, but I didn't add it to the purchase order. I realize normally you would add that to the purchase order, but for the sake of my demo, we're going to add it here to the vendor invoice. On the vendor invoice form, remember I said when I started out that this supports purchase order related invoices. You can add non Pio lines. You can do that through the add line. So if you have something, most commonly it would be a service item, for instance, that you would be adding. You can do that right from the line. We'll go ahead and do that. I'm actually going to use, though, Excel to add this line, just to show you that option. All of our forms are lit up with the Excel integration, so we'll go ahead and we will open the lines. Yeah, and this will take just a minute here. It has to authenticate and connect. All right, we'll enable the editing. Here's where the connector comes along. Yes, go ahead.
For the one line of product, can you have multiple distribution accounts split into multiple lines?
Yes, the question is, when we were in the distribution entry for that one line, could I split that across different accounts? There is a case where you can, and there are cases where you can't. Let's go over the cases where you can't first. If it's an inventoried item, we do not allow the splitting. If it's a fixed asset, we don't allow the splitting. If it's non-stocked in the way that, that my item was set up, or if it's a procurement category, you can split all you want to in any way that you want, as long as the distributions end up to be 100%. Yep, great question. Okay, so the Excel has populated. You probably saw this in other sessions, but I just wanted to point out there's some nice capabilities with Excel. It's integrated in, and it understands the controls that are in Dynamics. I'm going to just go ahead and I'll add my mouse here, and we'll quickly just publish this. Okay, and I won't save this. We'll go back, and I'll do a refresh. Oh, and I forgot to put in a quantity. But you can see it's added my line in here. And everything has defaulted in. All of the logic runs when we bring these lines in, so it finds my default accounts and does all of that for me. Okay, so this looks pretty good. We'll go ahead and let's actually attach that invoice that I had here. I'll go ahead and do this and attach the file. I have it just out on my hard drive. And it looks like it attached, so we'll go ahead and mark this. And I am satisfied with this, so let's go ahead and post this. And let's take a quick look at this now that it's posted. We'll go right into the Invoice Journal. I'll go ahead and filter this a bit. Okay, so notice here I'm going to find my invoice, and look what happens. New feature coming in the spring. We have a side-by-side viewer. What you're seeing here is the journal with the invoice image right beside it. And I'll just go up here. I had earlier posted some things that don't have attachments. You can see it dynamically will show and hide. And if I wanted to hide, I could just hide here. Now, this isn't the most interesting thing on a posted document, but where the scenario really lights up is in cases where perhaps you're using one of our ISV solutions or third-party apps that support OCR to bring in your invoices. We know a lot of our customers are using those types of integrations where they're bringing in the invoice, reading it, scanning it, bringing it in, and then they have an attachment to it, and then an AP manager or an AP clerk actually does the validation. This will show up right in that invoice entry form. So the clerk can literally have both of them right side by side and be going down through the lines, and it keeps up. So nice functionality coming this spring. Look forward to that. Okay, so we will continue. That was really the first method of entering an invoice. The second method that I want to show you, how many of you were in the end-to-end session this morning? A couple of you? Okay, I'm going to show you one of the things that we showed there. We have a very tight, we allow for a tight partnership between the external vendors and the internal accounting staff through the use of our vendor collaboration site. So I'm going to actually log in. I am logged in, I should say, in another session here. As an external vendor, I'm logged in as Erin Hagens, who's a contact at one of my vendors. And you can see the dashboard for Erin is quite trimmed down by the security policies. So this is the vendor collaboration site. And what this portal is it's a secure way for vendors to exchange invoice information with the internal accounting staff. You can see here, I won't go into the purchase order confirmation site, but that is capabilities as well. So if your vendor actually can confirm their own purchase orders, they can log in here to do that as well. I'll go into the invoicing area. Now the workspace here is quite simple. We don't overwhelm the vendor with a lot of data, but I think it's very pertinent data. You can see some tiles here. One thing I will do is drill in here. I mentioned this morning, really nice functionality that we have here is that the vendor can see what state their invoice is in. We often hear from our customers, especially as if I sit down with an accounts payable clerk, one thing I always notice is they take a lot of phone calls from vendors wondering, where's my check? When am I going to be paid? Giving them this type of information helps to make them more self-sufficient and reduce down those calls. But that's not the only thing that they can do here. They can actually go in and create their own invoice. They can submit. So let's just go ahead and do that. Let's see, what data do I even have in here? We'll just take the last one I have for this particular vendor. I will note these purchase orders obviously are limited to just the purchase orders that are for this vendor. They're not seeing all my purchase orders out here, only their own. So we'll go ahead and enter a few key things here. And we'll go ahead and create. And what the system does is it basically will flip this invoice. It'll bring in all of the lines from the purchase order, and the vendor can change the quantities and the prices, and they can attach things. So if they want to attach the image themselves, they could do that at this point. And then normally the process would be that they would just submit this in through workflow. They cannot post from here, so even if you didn't have workflow, like right now I don't have workflow on, so they can save. And that just ends up as an unposted invoice for the AP department to actually take a look at. Good question. The question was, is it identified in the pending area that it was from a vendor? No, it is not at this point. I think in the database, I think we do track the submitted, the fact that it was. I don't think we expose that anywhere though, but internally we do. Yep. Another question.
What kind of license do you need for this vendor collaboration? Is it a team?
The vendor collaboration, it is, yes, it used to be called the team member. It is, you don't need a full license. It's the least expensive one. I think, I honestly, I don't know the name of it anymore, but it was the team license. I think they did some name changing recently. But yeah, they don't have to be a full-fledged, expensive seat for you to be hosted in there. Okay, so that was the second way to enter invoices. The third way, again, asking yourself the question, do I have a purchase order or not? If you don't have a purchase order, the most common way to enter is through the Invoice Journal. And of course, these have been here for, oops, I clicked on the wrong thing here. These have been around years and years in many versions. We'll just go ahead and I'll enter in a new journal. Hopefully I'm not losing a connection here. Here we go. And actually I have one saved out here. Let's just go ahead and take a look at this. The journals, very popular. What we're finding is people absolutely love the Excel integration in the journals, and we're seeing more and more people just use that Excel integration to enter. This is where the data connector really shines because it does provide lookups for the data right back into Dynamics 365. So popular option. Journals, pretty standard. They're not related to purchase orders. In this case, I have a vendor expense for $1,000 that I've distributed across 2 different expense lines, just showing you that you can use different dimensions here. I can also enter, let me just show you the new line. I think most of you are probably aware of the defaulting, but I'll just go ahead and show that in case you have not seen that. And let's just say I want a new invoice for $2,000. In this case, my offset account defaulted in for me. You can set up default accounts, and let's just go ahead and I'll show you where you set those up. They're set up right on the vendor. And we'll go in and, I have to find my mouse there. And here is where you can set up that default account so that it will automatically default in for you as you're entering in the journal. So if you're interested in that, right off the vendor here. Okay, let me just check my slides here. See how we're doing. Just a reminder about where those accounts default. You will get these slides to take home with you, so you don't have to take notes furiously as I'm talking through this. But just remember, the debit side is coming from the inventory posting profiles, and the AR or the AP, excuse me, side is coming from the vendor posting profiles.
Question.
Yes.
So, I know when you show the PO side, you show the two-way match. Is three-way match, still same process?
Yes, the question was, can you bring in the multiple purchase orders with the three-way match? And yes, you can. We still have the same matching interface with product receipts, so if you want to include some other ones as well. Great question. Okay, just a recap to which invoice entry method should I use? Again, answer the question about the purchase order and whether you're using the purchase order. If you are, you're going to be driven into that first scenario with the vendor invoices. Don't forget about the matching, as we just mentioned. The journals, remember Excel there as well. Excel is everywhere, but those journals really lend themselves to using Excel. And then we have that vendor collaboration portal site as well. Okay. Let's cover some prepayment, because this is an area that we receive a lot of feedback on, and I get a lot of questions. Can't even tell you. I think every week I have questions on the prepayment. And part of it is the simple fact that we have two ways to do prepayments, and we get questions as to which way should I be doing the prepayment. So I want to try to cover that with you here. Do we have anyone using prepayments in the product right now? Prepayment invoicing? Okay. I'm going to cover the prepayment invoicing side first. That was introduced in AX 2012. And the basic process here, the scenario would be, let's say I ordered some goods, and let's say it's from someone overseas. They're manufacturing something for me, and it's a real long manufacturing process. One customer I talked to said from the time they ordered to the time it was built was about a year and a half. Because it was so large, they were required to put a down payment on it. Well, who on earth is going to remember a year and a half? You know, you probably turned over AP staff by then. Who's going to remember, what happened? And so you define that prepayment value on the purchase order. The next step of that is really key. You actually record a prepayment invoice. So if your vendor does not physically send you an invoice, this is not the method for you. That's one of your first keys. Does the vendor actually send you an invoice? If so, then you'd be in that prepayment invoicing bucket. If the vendor simply, you just know that they always require 10% down, you probably don't have to use the prepayment invoicing. If it's a case where when you confirm it with them, they say, hey, I want to have 10% down, you just go and make a payment to them without the invoice, that's not the side for you to be on. So kind of finishing out that side, though, when you post the prepayment invoice, the accounting behind it is that it debits a prepayment expense and it credits accounts payable. You're going to turn right around and pay that off, which will get rid of your accounts payable balance because technically you owe them nothing at this point. So the liability or the exposure for the prepayments on the prepayment invoicing side sits in that prepayment expense account. So that's another key difference. In contrast, let me kind of go this side of the story. The prepayments, you've always been able to do them in the payment journal themselves. You can just enter it in, not settle it with anything. The accounting behind that, of course, pretty simple. It's cash and AP. Because it sits in AP, it's not settled against any invoice. There's no invoice on that side to settle against. It stays on that vendor balance. So you have visibility right from the vendor if you're in the prepayment journal. That's the difference between these. Let me just quickly show you what we have on both sides. I won't go in to real deep detail here, but I'll show you. We do have some new functionality around prepayments as well. So let's just go ahead. I have a purchase order out here. I have a few of them out there actually. From vendor 1003. Oops, typed that in wrong. Oh, right the first time. Okay, I have a few out here. Let's just take a look at this first one. When I say on the, let's see, it was on our left side, you define the prepayment at the header. It's as simple as this. You just define a % or an amount up here, and you would save it, and then the next step would be the prepayment invoice. Then you'd pay it, and then the final invoice would come in, let's say a year later, and you'd apply that final invoice. That's a long time, and we had a lot of complaints about, hey, there's no visibility. I have to actually go in and hand pick if I have hundreds of thousands of purchase orders. That's not very efficient. So that is a pain point that we did address. And then the second pain point that we addressed on this side is the fact that once you go in for that final invoice, prior to these new enhancements, there was no warning, there was really no indication that you needed to apply. And I'm getting a nod there. So people would forget to apply or settle that final invoice. So let me just show you what we've done here. And these features were available in the fall release, but let's go back to the workspace maybe. That's the best way, most efficient way to get there. Oh, I just saw it. We have a new list page. It's the open prepayment list page. And what it shows you is really the state that your prepayment is in. You know, have you entered it but forgot to create the prepayment invoice? It's in one state. Or have you prepaid invoiced it but forgotten to pay it? Or are you in that bucket where perhaps you got all the way to the end and you forgot to apply it? This is really telling you what's open, what you still need to deal with in terms of the invoicing. And then the other thing that we did was we added a parameter. So let me go back to our Accounts Payable Parameters form. And it's in the prepayment invoicing area. And we have a prepayment application policy here. You can set that to just notify you so that when you go into the vendor invoice form, if the system detects that you have prepayment invoices that have been paid that you should be settling at this point, you'll get an alert message right away. It says, hey, go and do this. If you say automatic, it will automatically just apply it for you in the order, in date order, I think, if you have multiple.
What if you haven't paid it? You know, normally if you haven't paid it sitting out there, it wasn't recognized, right?
If you forgot to pay it, what the system will do is at the time you post that final invoice, it'll create a second voucher and it will reverse that prepayment invoicing for you. No notification though, I don't think. I don't think it tells you that it created it, but it does reverse out the accounting from that original prepayment invoice. Yep, great question. I would like to show you one more thing with the prepayments, and let me just go in and show you how that other side, I think that was the right side, works. I'm going into my payment journal, and I'll just quickly enter in a payment here. Let's just say $200. I'm not settling. That's how you know it's a prepayment. I could mark there is a checkbox. Sometimes we get a question about this. There's a checkbox as to whether it's a prepayment journal or not. You can mark this, but it does two things if you mark this. If you want to calculate sales tax on your prepayments, this will calculate the sales tax for you, and it will also look at the posting profile that's associated with prepayments in the AP parameters form. You don't have to mark this. That's a question I often get. You know, if you don't want to use a special posting profile or you want to just change it here, you can. I'll just go ahead. I'll leave that unmarked. And let's see. I'll select a bank. And I'll post this. And my real purpose for doing this is just to show you one of the complaints that people will sometimes say with this is, you know, I've got this prepayment. I know it's for a specific purchase order. Same thing on the sales side. I know it's for a specific sales order. Can't you just give me a drop list? I want to apply them or settle them. We don't have that capability yet. Something we are tracking. But you can settle it and mark it on a purchase order. So let's just go in here. I'll find a purchase order for this particular vendor. I'm sure I have a lot out here. And, oh, I only have one in received, but we'll go ahead and use this one then. What you can do is you can actually settle or mark that prepayment so that it is used for this particular purchase order. So what this is doing is the next time that I invoice, it will automatically settle and pick up and apply to this particular prepayment, kind of to help you so that you don't forget to do that. Now, one of the complaints that we do hear in this area is the scenario where you may have partial invoicing happening. So let's say the first invoice comes in for this and it's only for $50. What the system will do, it'll automatically settle the prepayment in the amount of $50, but then there's still $150 remaining on that prepayment. It doesn't automatically hook back up to this purchase order. Very, very popular suggestion. It is really getting towards the top of our list on things we need to address, but for spring release, I have to say we have not addressed that yet. But go ahead.
So once you mark it, is it in the other fact box panel at that point? Do you see that then?
No, because this is not in the prepayment invoicing scenario. So this is just the journal scenario, yes. Okay, I'll go ahead and we'll just cancel out of here, I think. All right, and I think that was really what I wanted to cover for the invoicing side. So let's switch hats here and let's go actually into the payments area. And we'll cover some of the payments area. Payment Workspace, of course, this is for the accounts payable payment clerk, the centralized payment clerk, and the manager, of course. Very similar. I know you're familiar already with what these look like. And again, I really like the center tabular lists. That's where I like to spend a lot of my time. We'll look at, we have the invoices past due. And here again, we've lit up some intercompany views here. So you can see 3 companies there. Those are 3 companies that the centralized payment clerk has access to make payments on behalf of. So in this case, I have a centralized payment hierarchy that involves 3 companies that I have access to. So I could go ahead and select my other companies, and I could view the data right from the list page here. Payments not settled. These are your unposted, or excuse me, not unposted, they're posted payments. They're prepayments, if you will. So they're not settled against any invoices. This is a huge improvement over AX 2012, if you're familiar with that, because we really didn't show those anywhere. You kind of had to hunt and peck through the transaction entry forms. Now you can see really the work that lies ahead of you with these unsettled payments right from within here. And again, we have the cross-company look there. The find transactions. This is probably one of my favorite features. You may wonder why it's blank right now. It will allow you to search across all of the vendor transactions. And we know our customers can sometimes have, 500,000 records in their vendor transactions area, if not more than that. So to populate the list would take a while. It'd be a performance hit. So that's why we don't populate it immediately. But here again, you just start typing. You think if you're the payment clerk and the vendor is calling you up, asking what the state of a certain transaction is, you can search across by vendor, by the numbers, if you happen to know that. I'll just go ahead and I'll say vendor Contoso. And you could quickly find, and more importantly, you can perform actions against it. You could see the settlement history. If it was partially settled, you can actually do your settlement right from here, or undo. Okay. Let's go ahead and we will go into the payment journal in a little more detail here. I'll go into the lines. Wait for this to open. All right, I think I did lose connection now. Let's go ahead and just refresh this. Okay, let's go into the lines now. Here again, I know some of you are familiar with AX 2012, so I'll just point out a little bit about the user interface. We really took a good look at the feedback that we had from customers complaining about the fact that our journals, in particular the payments, had some clutter. There were too many fields. It wasn't well organized. Most prominent buttons weren't promoted. So we've cleaned that up quite a bit. Just explaining to you, the buttons above the grid pertain to the particular line that you're on. In contrast, the things up in the action pane pertain to the whole journal. We'll go ahead and we'll go into that payment proposal. This is by far our most common way that people are creating their payments. And this will look quite a bit different. Again, if you are familiar with AX 2012, we put the most frequently used actions up to the top to try to really eliminate the clutter here. The first entries are helping you to whittle down the invoices that you're actually selecting. So you can select by due date or cash discount date or both. You can give it a certain time frame. So that's the collection of the invoices. Area that we get a lot of questions on is the payment date and the minimum payment date. The payment date, I'll just take an example. Let's say I have 3 invoices out there. Only these 3 invoices, they're due today, tomorrow, and the next day. If I use payment date, and let's say, let me back up 1 minute. Let's say I have a criteria here that goes out through that last day in 2 days. If I were to set the payment date, it will pay all of the invoices on that date. So let's say I put it on 3/15, it would pay all of those invoices as of 3/15. It doesn't care what the due date is in terms of the actual date that will get stamped. In contrast, if I put 3/14, let's say, this minimum due date, it will pay on the due date or on the minimum payment date. So in our case, if I set this to 3/14, I'm going to get 1 payment for today's invoice and tomorrow's invoice, and I'm going to get 1 dated on the 15th. So I'll have 2 payments. It's just controlling the grouping of it. It's really allowing you to pay as late as possible, if you want to think about it that way. Now, payment date is actually the most popular option. Most users have that set that way, but we do have some confusion around that minimum payment date and what that actually does. Yes?
Have you ever thought about having a parameter that would populate the payment date with the last date? So, because that is an issue that always comes up about that being blank. The first thing they do typically is sometimes they might want to date it the next day, but
Yes, excellent point. We do get quite a bit of feedback on that, and one of the things that we've been researching is can we have kind of a more intelligent payment proposal that's actually almost a machine learning, because typically, of course, you're paying every 2 weeks, or you have a set cycle. So that is something that we're looking at. We have not implemented that yet, but yeah, definitely. I think you'll be seeing some changes from us in the way that we're gathering that. Okay. I should mention that the other parameters aren't gone from AX 2012. They're all here. They're in the advanced parameters area. And then, of course, we still have your familiar sys query. If you want to restrict to certain records, you still have that capability. Okay, let us go. I'm just going to click OK here. And we'll go ahead and look at this. One thing I should have mentioned, we have an option in that payment proposal, that little form that slid out. You have the option to bypass this. You can hide the preview, I think is what it's called, create without preview. For those customers that aren't cash strapped at all, sometimes this is just annoying that we have this intermediate step. For those that do like to sort through the invoices and have to be careful, how much they're paying, certainly you would still want to come to this intermediate step. So what you're seeing here are the invoices that have been selected. And I'll just note a couple things here. One of the things that we heard a lot from customers is that they like to take this list and give it to their manager. So we do have this capability to export all the rows. And I can open that up. It's just going to open in Excel. So this is certainly a tool. You could give this to your accounts payable manager. It's kind of a nice little list that you can give to them. All right, we'll go back. You may be wondering, well, how do I know what the payment's going to look like? We do have the Show Payment Overview. You can have that displayed. And as I go through here, we'll pick a different vendor, for instance. You can go through and see how many how many checks will be printed. You may be wondering, well, this is kind of odd. Why would I have 3 checks? Remember, that's the method of payment that is driving that. So let me show you that. Let me just hide this for 1 second. And let me show you the method of payment, because this is an important parameter. Here we go. We'll view the details. In terms of the number of payments that are made, there's this setting, period. If I have this set to invoice, it will pay a check per invoice. Probably not what you really want to do. Most people have these set to total more frequently, and that just means that if I have a vendor that has multiple invoices out there, I'm going to do 1 check for the entire thing there. I'll go back. That's why you were seeing the multiple over on the side when I was showing the payment. Yes. Yes, the question was about the what do we support in terms of the payments, in terms of the other countries outside of the United States. It is the same as the R3, where we do have support for that. We have a new reporting tool, though, that is a little bit easier to use. It's a lot easier to use, actually, than like an SSRS type of format. The electronic reporting tool houses all of those formats across the world for the payment files. So, great question. Okay. We still have, don't forget about our multiple change. So if I highlighted a few of these and I wanted to change, let's say, the method of payment, I'll just pick electronic here. This will update the lines that I have selected. And they now are listed as electronic. I'll go ahead and I'll just create these payments. Okay, so my journal lines have been created. These are the actual payments. I didn't want to click out of there. Let me go back in. You can certainly, if you don't want to use a proposal, you can go line by line. And just a reminder that you can see what transactions are settled by coming into the settlement form. If you wanted to include some other things here, or you wanted to unmark, maybe you didn't have enough money to pay all of these, you could certainly unsettle right from this area. Just a few notes that I wanted to go through in terms of the generate. Generating, we ask you to fill in the method of payment and bank account information. You noticed I changed one of mine to electronic, and that is absolutely fine. You can have the mixture of payments and bank accounts right within the same journal. This gives you the opportunity to tell us which one you're processing at this point. I'll click OK here. Couple of notes I wanted to make on the payment advice. You can print the payment advice, which is just a listing of those invoices or credit memos, whatever you're settling. And it now can be, well, there's a few changes I should explain. One of the changes is that it is hooked up to print management as of last fall, so that you can actually email it through print management to the vendor contact. The other change is that I think in AX 2012 it used to list all of the vendors out in one report. Of course, it doesn't do that. It's segregated now by the actual vendor count. Another change that was made was that you can print the payment advice after you send the checks. So let's say I got through the process, I forgot to mark this. Say I generated all my checks. Back in AX 2012, that was really painful if you forgot, because you had to actually void them out and redo the process. If you got into that stage, that's no longer the case. Go ahead.
Can you also print it after you posted the journal?
Yes, you can print it after you posted your journal. So let me just go in here, and we'll close out of here. I'm sure I have lots and lots of posted journals in this company. And we'll take a chance and look at this first one. To do that, you would come right in here and print the payment advice. So great question. So, and if your vendor needed a copy, you know, they say they lost it or you actually forgot to print it, or whatever the reason is, that's where you would come to do that. So those are the changes in the payment advice area. A few things. Let's just go to the vendor itself. I want to show you one of the common ways that people do their research, especially in our prior versions, was they would go look at the vendor and they would go into the transactions area and do their investigation. Maybe they had forgotten to settle, for instance. They would find their two documents, and then settlement was inconveniently in a different area. So we have moved the settlement actions. They are right here at your fingertips. You can go in, highlight if this was the one you wanted to use. If it had been settled, you could see the history from right here. This one looks like it has not. Okay. You could actually settle from here, and you could undo from here as well. So let me just go in here, and I could quickly mark whatever documents I needed to right from the transactions area. Another area that I get a lot of questions on is the foreign currency revaluation. I won't go through this in detail, but I do want to point out some of the things that I get questions on. Foreign currency revaluation. Again, it's just the process of going through and looking at if you paid these things today, would I have a realized gain or realized loss? In this case, of course, because it's a revaluation, it'll post unrealized gains and losses for you based on the dates that you supply. This first parameter, lots of questions around this. Standard is by far and wide the most common. Standard does just the process that I just described, where it goes through, it looks at the invoice date on the original invoice and then compares that to the date you provided, finds the rate, and determines if there's an unrealized gain or loss. Minimum. I've never seen anyone in practice use this, but it's an option. It's available for you. It's a very conservative option, and what this does is it will not post any unrealized gains. It'll only calculate the losses for you. So if you want to be very conservative in your financial reporting, this would be a good method for you to use. And then Invoice Date. This is kind of like a reversal or an undo, if you will. Let's say that I had used Standard today, ran it, and then I realized, oh no, I imported the wrong rates this morning. I just want to get back to where I was. If I turned right around and did Invoice Date, what it does is it goes back to the rate that the original invoice used, and of course it just undoes whatever the mistake was that I had made. So that's an option for you. The other thing that I get questions on are the dimensions. Where in the world are these financial dimensions coming from? So you have a couple options here. None, of course, pretty self-explanatory. It will not add financial dimensions to your unrealized gain or unrealized loss. Table. Table will look back to the vendor's default dimensions and apply those to the unrealized gain or unrealized loss. Posting, I would recommend using posting because that goes back to the original invoice and it looks at the financial dimensions that are on the expense side of that original invoice. And I just think you want to go back to that original document because that's what you're revaluing. That's going to get you the closest results. So I recommend using posting in that case, but the other options are there for you if you need to use those.
There is no option to set up the exchange tab. Now you set them on a ledger, but if I want to use a different one that are on my ledger, it's not enough. I can do that now to GL, but here it's not.
Yeah, great point. There were changes made to the general ledger revaluation, and I would sure like to make those soon so that they are alike. We have not done that yet. One of the things that the general ledger team did was we've enabled specifying the actual type that you want to use. Look for that to come from us. I think you'll see that in both the AP and AR, although it's not there for this next release for spring. Yep. The only other thing, just real quickly, that I'm going to mention is positive pay. Positive pay existed in AX 2012, and I won't go through it. It's basically, it's just an automated fraud detection. It gives you a list of the checks. I just want to point out the setup is really all that I want to cover here. So let me go under cash and bank management. And let's see here. Positive pay formats, there they are. All I really wanted to mention was that data entities are used. So, format, I'll give it an Excel. We'll just pick this one. You point to your file, and of course this is always the hardest part, is the transformation file and mapping that up with what the bank gives you. But I wanted to note that the data entity, you don't have to go into our data entity area. It will automatically create it for you based on that XML. So that is a time saver. Just real quickly here, since I have this set up. You browse to the file you've already created, and then that's the hardest part, I think, is getting that file in a format from the bank. So, yep, that is exactly right. And then, of course, the positive pay, yeah, you just go and you set that up on the bank account itself by selecting it here. And then, of course, remember to put in a start date. That is an important little attribute there. I believe now it does default for you with today's date. If you forget to put in a date, it will create a file with all the checks you've ever written for this particular bank account, so you don't want to normally do that. All right.
So there's no interface to set up the XML file.
Correct. There's no interface to actually set up the XML file. We have a sample one out in the wiki that you can start with, but yeah, that is, and like I said, it's not the easiest thing to do, but you set it up once and then you're done for each of your payments. Very quickly, we'll just overview, the payment proposal. That's our most popular method. Key takeaways on the payment advice, remember that can be emailed and printed after you've sent the check and even after you've posted it. And then don't forget, if you're using our prepayment invoicing, we do have that new form for you. The tips on the foreign currency revaluation, remember the different types. Far and wide standard is the most common, but you do have some undo capability through that invoice date. And then if you want to be conservative, you can use the minimum date as well. And with that, I am going to say I encourage you to attend the Ask the Experts on Wednesday morning. My team will be there. We'll take any questions. If you don't get a chance to ask me afterwards, or if you think of additional questions, I will be there. Certainly come and ask anything on AR, AP, general ledger, bank, the whole gamut of financials. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions. I think I'm already over time, possibly. Well, I still have a few minutes here, but if you need to go, I'll release you now. If you want to stay for questions, though, certainly do that, and make sure you fill out your questionnaires. So thank you very much for attending. Does anyone have any questions that they want to ask in front of the audience? Yes.
One question.
Yes.
A lot of times on the PO invoice, you have the unit price you can change, but it allows you to change the net amount.
Yes.
And you get those error messages, and it really messes up all the postings behind it. Why do you have that somebody can change that net amount?
The net amount and not leave the invoice blank, or
Typically you change the unit price, but the system allows you to change the net amount. And you get these two error pop-ups, and if you post it, it really creates problems in the way it posts and time out. And I'm just curious
why you can change the net amount is really the question. I think it's for the reason where it doesn't divide equally. Like normally you would have 3 at $3.33, but maybe it's 3 at $10, and you just want to have the system figure out where to put that extra penny. So people will put in the $10. They know the total, they know the quantity, and that's the reason. Exactly. Yep. Yeah, that is the reason that I'm aware of, at least. Anyone else want to ask a question in front of the rest? Yeah, go ahead.
Let's say a scenario centralized payment. Let's say I'm a head office company and I make payments for all my stores. Now, when I make a payment proposal, because it's a centralized payment, I'm able to pay all the invoices in one shot for everyone. But now I want to tell the store that this is what I paid for you, and I don't want them to see the other payments that I've done for the other store. So is there a report that we have which we can use to say, okay, this is what I paid for store A, this is what I paid for store B?
I am not aware of a report that gives you that, but I can see where that would be really handy. Other people, probably you're nodding your head too. Yeah, not that that's something too that I should really think about putting on, like the analytics, the Power BI. That would be. We have the data, I'm sure. So why not expose it?
The way that we get around is when we come to the payment proposal screen, we take it out in Excel and then filter it. But it's a clumsy way to do it.
Yeah. That shouldn't be very difficult to do in our analytics tab. So that's great. Yeah. Okay. Anyone else that has questions, just come on up if you'd like. And again, if you don't have time, come to our session on Wednesday too.